Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome, I'm your host Roberto Mazza, and this is Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history and its people. Today it's with great pleasure that I am recasting an interview between my good friend and colleague Dr. Awad Halabi, who interviewed Ilan Pappe discussing his book Christian Zionism and the Israel Lobby. The conversation took place on October 5, 2024. And it was sponsored by the Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace and Friends of Sabeel, North America. This conversation is also available on YouTube, and I will post the link on the podcast notes. Now, please stay tuned and enjoy the conversation with Ilan Pappe.
Well, it's an honor for you to join us, Ilan. There have been some great works on the Israel lobby, such as Mearsheimer and Waltz, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, and Walter Hickson's Architects of Repression. And with your work, I think you've really made a monumental contribution in this more than 500-page, thoroughly researched study of the origins of the Israel lobby and Christian Zionism, the lobby's collaboration with Christian Zionism, and how the lobby for almost a century and a half has pressured, intimidated, threatened, harassed governments, politicians, church leaders, activists, trade unionists, and fellow Jews to support Israel's settler colonial project. So it's wonderful for us to be able to talk about your new great book. And maybe we can begin by discussing how you open your book by identifying a conundrum that you're trying to understand to explain why the lobby even exists. Can you explain this conundrum?
Yes, thank you, Awad. Thank you, the organizers, for inviting me. I do apologize if you'll hear some noisy background. I'm in a vicinity where people are celebrating something or another, so there will be some background noises. I hope not too disturbing. I do apologize for that, but I hope you can hear me loud and clear, yes, which is more important than anything else. Yes, let me answer your question, Awad. It is a conundrum, not so much when the lobby started. When you start a project, which is quite imaginary, it doesn't yet unfold as a reality. When you talk about something that some people might even call utopia, then it makes sense that you want to advocate for it with all your strengths, with all the efficient tools that an advocacy group would have. The conundrum for me was not so much the fact that there was a Zionist lobby when Zionism first appeared as an idea. The conundrum for me is, why does Israel still need a lobby today? That's the conundrum. Why are the Israelis probably the only country in the world that still tries to convince people that it has a right to exist, that still uses so much energy, resources, intimidation, I would even call it sometimes terror, in order to make sure that nobody provides any profound challenge, well, whether it's a moral challenge, a political challenge, to the right of the state to exist, to the validity of the Zionist project, to the moral justification for what Zionism did when it arrived to Palestine and what it did ever since it arrived in Palestine. And I think that the way that this advocacy works today, and this is an advocacy that has been going on for more than 100 years, to my mind, indicates that the advocates themselves understand that they have a real problem with justifying the commodity that they advocate for, namely a Jewish state in the midst of the Arab world, imposed by force on millions of Palestinians against their will, and unwilling to grant the Palestinians, ever since it arrived, equality, dignity, and rights, and is busy all the time in trying to get as much of Palestine as possible, which already they have succeeded by 1967, and have in it as few Palestinians as possible. So it is trying to sell a project that only can be explained or can only be materialized by force against the will of the people, and yet it wants to have a moral justification, maybe from its own people, maybe from the Jewish people, maybe from people who supported the idea to begin with, and definitely against anyone who challenges the morality and the moral validity, one can say, of this project.
Is this why Canada and Australia, as you write, don't have lobbies that are supposed to justify what they did to the native and indigenous people of those lands?
Sorry, I didn't hear well the question.
Is that why Canada and Australia don't have lobbies to justify what they did to the indigenous and native peoples of their lands?
No, so far they satisfy themselves with symbolic days of sorry, with rituals that ask for forgiveness for something which is already an established fact. The situation, of course, in Palestine is very different. The project of ethnically cleansing the Palestinian, the project of what Edward Said used to call the project of displacement of the Palestinians and their replacement by Jewish settlers, is incomplete. The Palestinians have a national resistance movement that is not giving in, and therefore that resistance movement itself even makes the project even more brutal, even more ruthless, and it's making it more difficult to defend it. Now, this kind of dynamics do not exist anymore in genocide, in the genocide projects of North America and Australia that somehow ended by the mid-19th century. I'm not saying that, of course, the indigenous people of these countries have disappeared and that they're not fighting a very just struggle for justice and equality. But I think it is they are not challenging the project of settler colonialism in those places in the same ferocity and the same energy with which the Palestinians do, because the Palestinians don't want to get to that final scene that already unfolded in other settler colonial projects.
Right. I think what you do of such a great job is explaining how Zionism in so many ways has its roots in Christian evangelical Zionism that promotes the really relatively new ideas of a return or restoration of Jews to Palestine in the 19th century. Because it's not some kind of peripheral theology, but it's the core belief of Christian Zionism and part of what motivates so many Christians, as well as the language of the lobby. Can you explain how this is not so much part of a traditional Christian understanding of the Holy Land and of end times, but it's a new eschatological end times belief in two very important new terms: dispensationalism and millenarianism. They both come up throughout the discussion of your book. Can you briefly explain these terms?
Yeah, definitely. And you're right. It's a relatively new idea that somehow emerges in the beginning of the 19th century in Britain, is taken by the people who conceived these ideas to the United States. So it transits from Britain to the United States and back from the United States to Britain, kind of. People reinforce their own theology by having these two bases of theological thinking on these issues. One idea, or maybe the two ideas, can be even explained together for the brevity of time. The idea, there is a basic element that connects a return of the Jews to Palestine, namely after, according to that narrative, after being exiled in the Roman Empire, a return as an indication for the beginning of the fulfillment of a divine scheme that eventually would lead to the resurrection of the dead, precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the beginning of the end of time. And there's a whole, as you probably, many of you would know, there's a whole eschatology connected to this apocalyptic vision. What is so important in this particular instance, from a theological point of view, which, by the way, also exists in Judaism, interesting, is the question of whether such monumental events happen only when God wants them to happen, or can the faithful do something to accelerate the process? Or if they do part of the plan themselves, they are the indicators themselves that the plan is already in motion. Why do I say it reminds me of Judaism? Because as you probably know, ultra-Orthodox Jews are anti-Zionist, because they say the creation of the Jewish state before the arrival of the Messiah is tampering with the will of God. But the religious Zionists say, no, the fact that we have already built a state is an indication that the Messiah is around the corner. And this is a similar idea, kind of saying the restoration of the Jews is the beginning of the process and not an outcome of the process, or maybe even ignites the process. How do they reconcile it with more traditional Christianity? How do they reconcile it even with mainstream evangelical Christianity? Well, we know that all kinds of other external ideas affect our interpretation of the faith, of religion. It could be anti-Semitism, it could be excitement about messianism, self-serving people who would like to be the new prophets. I'm sure there's a lot still to be done on that material. For me, what was important is that there were the early advocates in the modern time for the return of the Jews as a religious imperative. And they definitely had a powerful message, because we know today millions of Americans still believe that this is the right theological perception of Israel. And there are also some pockets of fundamentalist Christians also outside the United States. So yes, you had here a clear theological vision that the making of a Jewish state in Palestine as a result of the return of the Jews ignites a process that is apocalyptic and one that has many stations, as those of you are familiar with the theology, but I won't go into it, how it should unfold.
And I think that's why we could describe the lobby. I think, would you agree that it's the political manifestation of these theological beliefs? It's not just someone's spiritual beliefs. It puts it into action to create Zionism's settler colonial project. And that's why you referred to the Earl of Shaftesbury, who was president of the Bible Society in England in the 1860s, that he transformed from millenarian eschatology to millenarian activist. He's the first one to pressure governments. He didn't just believe this, he thought it had to be enacted through the governments.
Absolutely. And this is exactly what happened to the Bible Society, if you want, on the Jewish side. What you have here is either imperialists, in the case of Shaftesbury and his friends in the Evangelical Christian Church, or colonialist in the case of some of the early Jewish leaders of Zionism, who take the Bible. It's interesting, they take the same book, the Old Testament, not the New Testament, take the Old Testament, the Bible, and transform it from a spiritual book, a book that tells you how to deal with God, how to deal with each other, into an historical document, in the case of Judaism, and into a prophetic document in the case of Christian Zionism. And there is a political motivation behind it, undoubtedly. I would even say that a bit later on, some of the evangelical Christians, especially in the United States, also have economic interests. This is not, it's not purely political only. There are interests in the Middle East, there are interests in Russia that are also connected to it. But what you have here is politicizing the religious message, which, as we know, happened in Islam as well, happens now in India with Buddhism as well, the one that Modi is propagating. Yeah, nothing new in this in many ways, apart from this bizarre kind of fact that one small piece on earth, where a small community of people are being targeted by these people with global and universal messianic messages that begin a process that would end with their catastrophe as a result of that. And that's something very, very unique, you know, if you look at the trajectory from that kind of theology to what happened just a century later to the people of Palestine as a result of these ideas that, as you rightly say, are not eschatological anymore. They become political programs. Right. And of course, then they find more secular allies, imperialists, colonialists, capitalists, who jump on the wagon, don't mind at all if it is described as a religious project, that's okay. But their interest is not religious at all. The best example, of course, are the early Zionist activists who were secular Jews. That led me and others to say that there were Jews who did not believe in God, but believed that God promised them Palestine.
Right. So it's not just religious beliefs, and it's not just imperialist visions that Zionism fulfills British imperial interests of having a friendly regime in the Eastern Mediterranean, but it's also, you highlight, there are anti-Semitic motivations. And we see that especially with Lord Balfour and the Declaration of the Balfour Declaration of 1917, that for him, he has different anti-Semitic motivations to support Zionism. Particularly, if you want to talk about that, the
yes,
Jewish immigrants.
Definitely. Well, I would say, Awad, first thing I would say, the success of Zionism in a way is that it catered to different interests, and it served different interests saw in Zionism as a way of fulfilling their own objectives, even if some of these objectives contradicted each other. For example, among the people who supported Zionism, whether they were Christians or Jews, there were also people who were Philo-Semites, namely people who really wanted to save Jews from anti-Semitism, because let's remember that the background for the emergence of the Jewish Zionist movement was the increase in anti-Semitic movements in Europe as a result of the rise of Romantic nationalism in the second half of the 19th century. The Romantic nationalist movements in Europe that broke down the European empires inside Europe were very they were connected to the Catholic Church, and they were looking for a way of purifying the race of the new Romantic national movements, and the Jews were the easy target to show who is really a patriot and who isn't. So there was, and I think there were a lot of Jews and Christians who did understand that this is going to be even worse than just a pogrom here and there. And at the same time, the most important supporters are people who are anti-Semites, as you said. So the contradicting kind of things here. Now, what is interesting about the anti-Semites in this powerful alliance that eventually would turn Palestine from an Arab state into a Jewish state and would lead to the displacement of the Palestinians and their destruction and everything that we see today, is that some of these anti-Semites were Jews themselves and not just Christians. What united Lord Balfour, who was a Christian, and Lord Rothschild, who was, as you know, a Jew, and other British aristocrats who from a Jewish origin, or American Jews who already were quite successful economically in the United States at the time that Zionism emerges, is a fear that anti-Semitism in Central and Eastern Europe would push the poor Jews to Britain and the United States. And whether you were a Jew or a Christian who had belonged to the elite, you didn't like this prospect. And they talked, what I found, why did I write a book of 500 pages? Because I said, I need to bring long quotes so that people would believe me that that's how people wrote and talk. Otherwise, you would think, oh, maybe I'm interpreting something. It's not a very interpretive book. This is a book that allows the reader to go into the material themselves. You have to hear it to believe it, rather than for me to be the messengers and telling you, you know how these people talk. You can hear the way they talk about the danger of the Jews from Eastern Europe coming to Britain. And not only Arthur Balfour, but also Anglo-Jewish aristocrats are saying it. So yes, this was a powerful motivation behind the reorientation of Jews from especially the poor areas of Europe into Palestine. Now, this is something, it's an historical structure. This unity of purpose between anti-Semites and Zionists exists to this very day, because both movements want to see the Jews outside of Europe, outside of the West. By default, it's an alliance. It's an alliance. You don't want the Jews to stay in Britain, and I don't want the Jews to stay in Britain. I want them all to be in Palestine. So that's where you are bedfellows, whether you like it or not, into this idea. And then it becomes, of course, more cynical. And even in the early days, the rise of violent anti-Semitism gives more incentive to Jews to go to Palestine. Palestine was not that attractive to most Jews to begin with. It is not a culture and a geography and a climate that they were used to. They didn't really go in their hundreds to Palestine. So it was a blessing for Zionism, actually, that anti-Semitism became, on the one hand, more violent, and secondly, that the anti-Semites in the West, in the United States, especially in Britain, were powerful enough to put quotas on the number of Jews that can come to the United States and Britain. So these two things together pushed many more Jews than I think would have otherwise were going to Palestine as settlers.
I want to pick up on a couple points. One is I think I've never heard this before. It's a brilliant point. You say that the Zionist activists identify Jews in Eastern Europe and in Palestine as a nation. Therefore, they should have their own rights. but they didn't designate Jews in England, France, Canada as a nation, because that would bring up dual loyalty. So they're more than happy to say they really don't belong there, get them out, but we get to stay. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I learned about it because I was lucky. I got the minutes of the most important, the early important Zionist convention in America in 1918. An outfit called the American Jewish Congress was inaugurated in Pennsylvania in 1918. And the minutes of that meeting include speeches by people like Brandeis and Judge Brandeis and others. And at first I didn't understand, why are they devoting so much time to explain that Jews are a nation in Russia, Romania, Poland, and Palestine, but not in Britain and the United States. And of course, you're absolutely right. The problem would, if they are a nation also in Britain and the US, they would be accused of dual loyalty. So they explain, they actually don't explain, they state. There's no explanation, because how can you explain it? What's the difference? What's the difference, right? They don't explain, because there is no analysis that can explain it. But they state, and the Congress accepts it, that Judaism is nationalism in certain locations and not nationalism in others. But I think below it, there's even a deeper layer, the one that I already found in the diary of Theodor Herzl, where he recorded his conversations with leading Germans and British politicians, where he said to them very clearly two things. He said, the Jews in your country, the wealthy Jews, the important Jews, don't worry, they would never go to Palestine, he tells them. You shouldn't worry about that. And on the other hand, the Jewish proletariat, as he called it, the working class of the Jews, would not come and make trouble in your own countries. These are the words of Herzl. This is not the words of an anti-Semitic, pundit. And this is there all the time. It becomes part of the DNA in many ways, and is important to understand that Palestine became this receptor of, among other things, for a problem that was really created by anti-Semitism and racism towards Jews. And then, of course, the Zionist project itself became a project of racism towards the Palestinians.
Right. Excellent point. And just one final point. You make a great point that if the Zionist activists during World War II had pestered the U.S. to admit more Jews into the U.S., it would have been, they would have lost that close political connection they had with Washington politicians. So they were a little more cautious in how they pressured the U.S. administration.
In Britain.
And in Britain, the same thing. Interesting. Let's move on to this larger topic of what you refer to as the Holy Trinity of Christian Zionists, Zionist activists, and the neoconservatives, or this unholy trinity, sorry. And you identify that after World War II, Zionism, Christian Zionism becomes less mystical, more realist. Theologians like Reinhold Niebuhr, who was criticized the Nazis, opposed segregation in the U.S., but was a staunch supporter of Israel and Zionism. He kind of is the bridge between the religious and the right-wing what becomes the right-wing neoconservatives later in the Republican Party. And we see how does, like, what I would like to hear more of is how do the neoconservatives work so closely with a religious group? because the Christian Zionists have religious motivations to support Zionism. The neoconservatives have mostly U.S. and imperialist motivations to support Israel. How do the two blend together and almost seem as one?
Yes, I think that the key for this kind of coalition is, first of all, the membership in both in AIPAC, the main pro-Israeli lobby that precedes the phenomenon of neoconservatism. AIPAC is much older than the neoconservative think tanks and movement, and some of the people who work for AIPAC work for the early neocon think tanks. So, and they are actually creating their less a Christian Zionist atmosphere, but much more develop a new narrative that is the narrative that says that actually the creation of the State of Israel was meant to help in the Cold War, first of all, against the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union sort of disappears, they all adopt these Samuel Huntington ideas of the clash of civilization, and therefore Israel now is the bastion, or the last bastion, against the barbaric civilization, whichever it is, that endangers the West in general, in particular the United States. So I think that the first alliance is between the neocons and AIPAC, which is a very important alliance. And you know, some of the early leaders of AIPAC even left AIPAC the moment that alliance was solidified, like Tom Dine, who used to be the vice president of AIPAC. And he said in an interview that he suddenly realized that the holy kind of principle in AIPAC of being bipartisan was totally neglected by a new generation of people who were leading AIPAC in the late 80s and the beginning of the late 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. The alliance that was begin to be to emerge in the Republican Party between Christian Zionists and neocons was the one that was eventually brought into the fold as the last leg in this unholy trinity. So I think what you had here is different interests, but that are translated into the same objective, namely a very Islamophobic perception of reality, an anti-Arab perception of reality, and this strong belief that the United States needs to use force in order to protect its own national interests and the interests of its allies. This went together later with a more simplistic and maybe a more idiotic slogan, "Make America Great Again," but doesn't matter. The ideas are there. And I think already Walt and Mishmeyer and Walt, very well presented to us the evidence that this unholy trinity was very much behind the invasion of Iraq in 2003. But it was there, of course, before. So I think that this is the kind of repeat on the early alliance that enabled a small group of Jewish settlers to set foot in Palestine and eventually ethnically cleanse the Palestinians because they had this powerful alliance behind them. It's the same idea because the alliance is made of components that might not always have a lot in common, but the very project of a Jewish state, of what they might think of as a Western state, as a pro-American state, which is not Arab, which is not Muslim, kind of ignited the imagination of different groups of people for different reasons. And I think AIPAC's main role was to make sure that you can cement these visions and ideologies into one powerful impact on the way American policy is perpetrated on the ground.
Right. I know we're getting close to the end of time of our discussion, and we're going to open it up to larger discussions. But I wanted to ask a couple more questions. One, Jimmy Carter is seen as the ideal president. He's openly evangelical, but he has been the recipient of this vitriol from the Israeli lobby. And Barack Obama, I think, is an interesting case, especially after 2009 in his speech in Cairo, where he is the first president to mention the Nakba and calls for Palestinian statehood. But you make the point that the Christian, the pro-Israel Zionist lobby played second fiddle to the Christian Zionists, as you have Glenn Beck and Fox News constantly berating him. But then you ask the question that he eventually abandoned trying to challenge Israel on the question of Palestinians. And you ask the question, was there an alternative? Can you tell us how you answer that?
Well, there was an alternative to
Obama's ability to try to challenge Israel. He kind of just gave up because of the pressure.
Oh yeah. I see what you mean. When I read about Obama and I read his own autobiography and thinking about how he moans in the book of how he was tortured by the pro-Israeli lobby and how eventually many things that he wanted to do he couldn't do because of the power of the lobby. I was also thinking about Jeremy Corbyn in Britain being ousted from the leadership of the Labour Party by the pro-Israeli lobby in Britain. And in both cases, I'll put Carter aside because it's a different historical period and it's difficult to judge what could have been done or could not have been done in the early 70s. But Obama belongs to a period we are more familiar with, which definitely already offered options, different options. Yes, it is a matter of adopting something which maybe is not human, but has to be adopted as a recipe for the future. There is a sense that also in the way Obama and Corbyn and others behave, that they really think that there is a kind of a logical discussion here going on, that the other side has an issue, and maybe you should accommodate this issue. So maybe there is a golden mean between your position and their position. So you're trying to show genuinely that you, of course, also care about what they care, but there are other people you care about, the Palestinians. And you somehow think that this ability of yours to accommodate, to compromise, to come towards the other side is something that would be reciprocated. If I would put it bluntly, a far more assertive Obama and a far more assertive Corbyn and others who would not cave in because they already were in powerful position would have weathered the storms against them. However, they somehow did not understand. If I put it in the most simple term, I think I even used this phrase in my book. If you don't stand and sing the Israeli anthem with the Israelis, you are the enemy of Israel. You cannot be a good friend of Israel and critical of Israel, which is what they thought they could do. You can't, because, and this is also maybe a misunderstanding of how dramatic, that's why I don't go to Carter, but how dramatically Israel changed after 2000. That Israel was, and anybody with and even a modicum of knowledge of Israel could already state in 2000, there is no alternative to the right wing in Israel. And Israel will be a right-wing country, an extremist country, a racist, aggressive country that would do to the Palestinians whatever inhibitions in the past prevented them from doing. This was all there in the. I wrote about it already in 1999, and I wasn't the only one. But this image that Israel is a complicated society, that American pragmatism has its interlocutor on the Israeli side, all this made it was like two sides. One side was behaving like the mafia, and the other side was behaving like a diplomatic corps. And the diplomatic corps was surprised that in the end of the day, someone came and shot them rather than continue the dialogue when they had enough of the dialogue. And that's where Obama totally failed. Not only him, I think also the people around him. Remember who was around Obama advising him on Israel and Palestine. Kind of liberal Zionists who were very important in formulating policy, believing probably genuinely that peace is around the corner, that a better Israel is around the corner, that there is a peace camp, all kinds of assumptions which were totally wrong, had nothing to do with the reality, and weakened their ability to face AIPAC and its power in Capitol Hill. And eventually they all, succumbed to that power. Take someone like Martin Indyk, who was a powerful man in AIPAC. Towards the end of his life, he was very critical of Israel and immediately became the enemy of Israel. They didn't even remind anyone of the fact that he was running AIPAC for years. That doesn't count. That doesn't count. The moment you utter a word of criticism, everything you did in the past is erased. And there's only two dimensions to this. Either you're an enemy or a friend. There's nothing in between. And I think you would have expected a powerful person at the head of the executive arm to be able to withstand such tactics. But we'll see. Maybe it will. I'm not deterministic. I hope this will happen one day.
Final question for me, Ilan. We're now nearing almost 1 year of a genocide in Gaza and now a regional war. How important has the lobby been in supporting Israel throughout their war crimes? And how do you explain the support President Biden has given to Israel, who describes himself openly as a Zionist?
President Biden began his career in the Foreign Affairs Committee on Capitol Hill the day Israel ended the career of Senator Fulbright. I have no doubt, I haven't talked to President Biden, and maybe someone should, if he will be honest enough. I think he understood very well how Capitol Hill works in regard to AIPAC. Remember how powerful Fulbright was and how dramatic was his the way AIPAC killed his political career. And I think it stayed with Biden. And Biden was an example for the American politicians who entered the political system in the early 1970s, which AIPAC already could rely on, that by inertia, without pressure, would support Israel, because they already had the example of what happened to Fulbright, who tried to take AIPAC head on. And I think that was a very important message to them. And they were not presidents and so on. So at the time, and I think that remains with you. That remains with you. This almost, it's part of your DNA as an American politician to know the red lines you should not cross, and you don't need to get a message again from AIPAC to remind you what are the red lines. And automatically, when an event like 7th of October unfolds and the Israeli reaction to it, there is almost, you can predict what would be said, what not be said, and what would be done or would not be done, as if really the personality of the president is even not important in that case. So AIPAC was there to make sure that these red lines were kept, and when the red lines are not kept, which mainly people would say Israel commits genocide or might ask for American sanctions against Israel, you saw what happened to some of the candidates, the uncommitted Democrats, some of who had not even a chance of being nominated. How much money and energy and power AIPAC used to kill their careers in order to assert its power again. So AIPAC is there to make sure that what it expects anyway to happen, namely that the American administration would talk the talk but would not walk the walk when it comes to Israel. It would not stop the genocide and would not stop the Israeli criminal policies towards the Palestinians, but to make sure that this is still the case, given the fact that there's these really dramatic changes in American public opinion, in the willingness of a younger generation to challenge the American policy, or the uncommitted Democrats who become an electoral issue even, or have turned Palestine into an electoral issue, which we have never thought would ever happen in the United States. Maybe support for Palestine can help an electoral issue. All this, they are there just to make sure that these developments are like, are like small holes in the dam that have to be filled. Otherwise, they would burst. The dam would burst. By the way, I do think the dam will burst. I think just they don't have enough fingers to put in the various holes that already are there. And the dam is the immunity shield that AIPAC provides against any meaningful American policy that can bring an end to the genocide in Gaza and the suffering of the Palestinians in general.
These were Professor Awad Halabi interviewing Professor Ilan Pappe, author of Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic, published by One World Publications in 2024. Once again, I would like to thank the Friends of Sabeel North America 2022 that allow me to recast this interview. You can find the link to the 4 conversations, including the questions from the audience, on YouTube, and the link will be published on the podcast notes. Once again, thank you very much for tuning in to Jerusalem Unplugged.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.